about then the identity of the Antichrist, the fact that he's actually a resurrected individual. So Revelation 17, verse 8, he's referred to here as a beast. Revelation 17:8. We talked last week about the use of symbolic language, and that's a well-known symbol from the Old Testament. Daniel characterizes ancient kings and their kingdoms using beasts to describe them. King Nebuchadnezzar is characterized as a lion, for example. So, again, this is a very common symbol, and I don't think that's one thing that, really anybody's disputing. Everyone understands that this is talking about the Antichrist, even though it's called a beast, right? So we're not talking about a literal animal here. But it is describing the Antichrist. And I want you to notice what it says here in verse 8. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. So, you've got this beast here, and note the three tenses that John uses here, that he basically is using to describe the Antichrist. He was. Now remember, John writes at the end of the 1st century, about 95 AD, give or take. And John is saying he was, past tense, which means at the time that John writes the book of Revelation, he is already dead. So when we say somebody who lived before, he is somebody that lived at least 2,000 years ago. Because he's already dead by the time John writes Revelation. And so then the second tense, he is not. That's what presently. All right, so he was, he's not now. But then we get to the future, and he shall what? Well, he shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. The expression bottomless pit, that's King James English, a popular English way of describing. It's actually called the abyss. The more common term is the word Hades. So that's what it's talking about, but understand that the expression bottomless pit is our English expression. It's just Hades is what it's talking about, not actually a pit that doesn't have a bottom. It's a place that's Hades, that is very deep. Okay? And that's why in English we call it bottomless pit, because it's very, very deep. But the basic point here is that he is going to ascend out of there. So he lived before John wrote. He's now dead at the time John is writing, but at some point in the future, he is going to come out of the abyss. Well, what does this tell you about? We talked about the different interpretation approaches again, last week. One of them said, well, John's just all describing stuff that happened in the 1st century. Well, John's writing at the end of the 1st century, AD 95, and he says this is going to happen. He's going to ascend out of the pit. He's not all just describing history. And again, you see the three tenses. This isn't all history. I'm describing past, now I'm describing the present, and then I'm describing something that's going to happen in the future. And that type of terminology is repeated at the end of the verse, but he doesn't come back and repeat where he's coming from the second time. But at the end, he just says he was, and he is not, and yet is. Meaning, in other words, and yet he'll be here again. Coming out of Hades. We talked about that in Sunday school. That's past Sunday, right? Hades being in the heart of the earth. That's where unsaved dead people will go when they die. And in this age, we could say the Earth's history. Well, that's where unsaved people have always gone when they've died. So whenever he died, that's where he would have gone, and he's been there ever since he died. But he's going to come out of there. That's why we talk about, obviously he's going to be resurrected. Because he's in the realm of the dead. He's going to come out of the realm of the dead. Jamie, you had a question?
Well, just the part where it said the part that we come in that they will behold him, except for the people that were written in the book of life, which is another indication that he has raptured the people out, because we're not here to behold him.
Right.
Correct?
Right. We're not here to behold him now. There will be, I said, people who are going to be getting saved
At
during
that
the
time.
tribulation
But I
period.
mean, it does seem to reference that, for the people that are saved and sitting around, you're going to be pulled out and not waiting around going, oh, behold this wonder.
Right, yeah.
There's another just small indication that we'd be raptured out.
I think the key point in this case is that the whole world is going to be fooled by him except those that are either saved in the tribulation period or that are elected, meaning they're going to get
Okay,
saved
so
at some
they'll-
point. But
they'll
they're not
see
going
through
to
the-
be, yeah, they're not going to be taken in by the, by the light. Now, when we talked before, we were talking a few minutes ago about, a little earlier about, does he make a fake identity since he's, not being born and growing up, right? Does he create a fake identity, fake birth certificate and all that? Or does he just pop up on the world scene, which adds that much more to his mystique? What is this? Is this guy from some advanced race in outer space? Is this guy some kind of god? Where did he come from? Well, it does specifically, talk about how the whole world wonders when they behold this guy who has come back from the dead. I'm not sure if the text is saying, in other words, that they are consciously aware that he has come and they're impressed by that, or it's just saying, they're going to be impressed by the guy, not necessarily tying it to the fact that he's resurrected.
What are you saying, like, what they say, one like when Jesus comes back down?
What about
You say the word, one like when Jesus comes back?
Well, this will be before Jesus comes back. We're talking about a coming period of 7 years. Jesus will come back at the end of it. All who are believers right now will be taken out, and all the unbelievers will be left. And there will be a 7-year time period from after he takes all the believers out of here, 7-year period, and that's when the Antichrist will have his heyday. But during that 7 years, there will be unbelievers who will become believers. And this passage is saying everyone's going to be impressed by the Antichrist except those people who are going to end up becoming believers.
Really?
Yeah.
So there will be somebody to come back before him?
What about coming back?
There will be somebody to come back before Jesus?
Well, Jesus will come back to take us to heaven so that we won't be here during those 7 years, so that the believers won't have to deal with the Antichrist.
Really?
Yeah.
So the ones who did believe and he won't come get, then they might be the Antichrist.
Right, if you're a believer, right, you don't have to deal with the Antichrist.
Really?
Yeah. Just like, when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, he sent angels to get Lot out of there before he destroyed it. And it's the same thing. He's going to take us out of here before all that bad stuff happens.
Really?
He takes his people out.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. Like I said, we're talking about, what he will do and when he will do it, because you hear a lot of people say a lot of things. We're wondering, is this the Antichrist or is this the mark of the beast? We're talking about things before you got here, like the vaccine, could that be the mark of the beast? Are we seeing the mark of the beast? Well, those questions are coming from people who don't understand the timing
It
here.
ain't saying what to be the mark of the beast. Because people, I'm thinking, see, when they say mark of the beast, I'm looking for a beast.
Oh, right, and that's a symbolic expression. It's actually talking about a man.
So the beast could be the vaccine or something.
Well, it is talking about an actual person.
Okay.
The person known as the Antichrist.
Okay.
The beast represents him. Well, I say him and his kingdom.
Yes, sir.
In the Bible, kings and kingdoms are very closely associated. You really can't
Right.
separate the king from the kingdom.
Right.
So sometimes the beast will refer to his kingdom and sometimes the person. Now, in this passage, we know it's talking about the person and not his kingdom. And how do we know it's talking about an individual and not his kingdom? Because kingdoms don't go to Hades. Right? A kingdom can't go to Hades. People go to Hades. Okay. So this is talking about the individual who, like I said, he's some unsaved man who's been in Hades the last 2,000 years, but he's coming back on earth. Now, if you jump down to verse 11 in the same chapter, John repeats that again. He says, the beast that was, and even not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven, and goeth into perdition. But again, notice he refers to him. He was, he's not now, he's going to come along, and there's a context of the verse when it says he's the eighth, meaning the eighth in a series of world kingdoms and powers. His kingdom will be the eighth major world empire in the history of the world. But he was, and he's not now, so he doesn't live in, he's not alive by AD 95. If you'll jump back to chapter 11, we find the same expression used about him once again. Chapter 11, verse 7. Here he's talking about the two witnesses, and we'll get more into this a little bit later about these witnesses and who they are. That comes later, but there are two guys who are witnesses for the tribulation period. We're told that when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them. So this is, again, we're told that he comes out of, Hades again, bottomless pit, that's King James English, but Hades is where he is, okay? So it says it more than once. It's repeatedly stressing the fact that, the Antichrist is somebody who right now is in Hades. Right? So he definitely resurrected the individual. When we talk about I talk about the fact that, the king and the kingdom are closely associated. Some people just think it's odd that the Antichrist would be resurrected. I don't know why. We have a number of resurrections in the Bible, like Lazarus, the 12-year-old girl, and so forth. But for some reason, they just think, well, he can't be resurrected. Like, why not? A lot of people got resurrected in the Bible. Why can't somebody get resurrected during the tribulation period? So, just on the basis that they think it's odd, they reject that notion, even though there are multiple resurrections in the Bible. So they will argue that in this case, like I said, it is talking about the kingdom. It's going to be a kind of a resurrected or revived kingdom. That's what he's talking about. But that's why I pointed out that kingdoms don't go to Hades. That's why we know here we're talking about the king and not the kingdom. So some will say that they, in other words, they know about the passages here, but they say, well, that's not talking about the man. That's talking about his kingdom. Like, the kingdom don't go to Hades. You got a question?
Yeah, in my studies and readings on Revelation, I know the individual who is the Antichrist is killed after a short period of appearing on the scene, and then he's resurrected.
Well, now, yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. That is one of the approaches. Some people read this as something that's going to happen during the tribulation period. And then they say, well, that's one of the things that will make him so impressive to people, because they'll see him killed and resurrected. I think that's Tim LaHaye's idea, in the Left Behind books. I think that's how Tim, but I'm not 100% sure that if I'm remembering that right. But I think that's his view. But again, if you're reading the language in Revelation closely, again, John said he was at the time he's right, and he's not now alive. So John is saying he's already dead. The only thing that is future from John's perspective is his resurrection. So you can't have him dying and being resurrected in that future 7-year period. John says he already lived and he's dead now. So the only thing that's future is the resurrection. So that's the problem with that view again. They have to kind of... Now, there's one other, we'll get to that. There's one other passage that they would point to that I think lead them to that idea, and that's a case where I'll say, now we're talking about the kingdom and not the king. So they get exactly backward. In other words, this is talking about the king and not the kingdom. They take the passage that talks about the kingdom and they try to apply it to the Antichrist. So that's how they get there. And like I said, in the future night, I hope to talk a little bit about that. So we'll come back to that idea. Because his empire is viewed as like a revived and resurrected empire too. So he's a resurrected man, his empire is resurrected too. And that can be a little confusing for people. But clearly here, like I said, these passages, it's the individual, because empires don't go to Hades. I see it, Georgia.
I have a question.
Okay.
So, timeline-wise, the Antichrist could possibly be here now.
Yeah, I would say that, that he could be. If the rapture was here as state setting. So most of the things we know about him, we won't be seeing, right, we won't be seeing because we're going to be taken out here before those things happen. But he himself could be here because, there presumably have to be some stage setting.
Right.
Where he's, gets known by other world leaders and so forth, and is already working his way into positions of power. So, I mean, he could be somebody that we could be seeing on the, on the national news and just not realizing this is the guy someday.
We won't recognize him because we're going to be back down before it actually.
Right, before the things that he's known for will happen. But we might actually see him and just not realize that we're looking, looking at him. Who knows? It could be somebody that, like I said, though, very quickly, though, the media can make a star out of somebody. Probably most people, if you'd ask the average American, who's the president of Ukraine, they would say they have no idea. If you ask them now, have you heard of Volodymyr Zelensky? It's like, who hadn't heard of Zelensky? So somebody like that could become a rising star. It's like, Zelensky, he's the Antichrist. Who knows? I'm not saying he is, I'm just saying, who knows, maybe we're looking at the face of the Antichrist there.
It seems so nice.
Maybe this is the beginning of him rising to international prominence, maybe, I mean, he has a nice smile, he seems to be a nice guy. But we know he's not as nice as he 100% appears, because this is the guy who also shut down media in his country. If you don't, then he shut them down.
We must remember that Satan is a great deceiver.
Great deceiver. So that's why we could be looking, looking at him, but it's just, it would be overstated.
Yeah, this could be how he comes to prominence.
Yeah, I mean, you never know. It could be some kind of event like this that happens in the world that brings them to the attention of the world, and then people begin to gravitate towards it. Now, there's a leader, this is what the world needs. Somebody like this, who stands up against the forces of evil type of thing. So, another key thing we know about him that I do think is an important piece of the puzzle that a lot of people miss is that he is a Westerner from the West. Okay? So, in other words, like, he's not Chinese, okay? He's not President Xi of China. He is from the West. Now, exactly how far west, what part of it, but basically the Western world, like, Europe,
Right.
America, the Western Hemisphere, or Europe, as opposed to the Far East, or as opposed to the Middle East. I'm sorry?
Not Africa.
Not Africa? Right, it'd be more like Europe or the Western Hemisphere. So, yeah, not likely coming from Africa, Deep South, or the Middle or Far East. And we know that, again, look quickly back at Daniel. Of course, not everything we know about the Antichrist comes from Revelation, but Daniel and Revelation combined are the two key sources of information. And of course, I'm running over this a little quickly. There are more things I could say and more text I could point to make some of these
You say
points.
Daniel?
Daniel.
Oh, Daniel.
But Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, and this is talking about the Antichrist. Again, there's pretty wide, agreement about that. So, despite, a lot of areas where Bible scholars are going to disagree on some things, there's certain things everybody's agreed on. And everyone's going to, agree that the last part of chapter 11 in Daniel is describing the Antichrist. I mean, among Bible-believing people. The crazy scholars who don't even believe the Bible, the real critical ones, they're not going to say that because they don't believe Daniel could actually predict the future, of course. Or among people who actually believe the Bible. So Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push on him. So here's the Antichrist, and he's working for world dominance, and the king of the south is pushing at him. Now, unless he's fighting against the south, not likely, do you think he's from the south? Probably not. Right? Okay. And by the way, the orientation here would be, say, Israel, say the focus of Israel. So he's not south of Israel. Well, at least that's going to rule out Egypt and Africa and all that. Right? And then the verse continues, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. The king of the north is going to come against him. So is he from the north? Unless he's attacking himself. Right?
Yeah.
So he's not from the south, he's not from the north. North, how far north? Probably far enough to be Russia. So, Russia's not done with wars. Okay? So that would probably be Russia. Okay? Pretty far north. So he's not the north, he's not the south. Okay, jump down to verse 44. Jump down to verse 44. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with a great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. Well, again, he's got bad news coming from the north. See, he's trying to hold this thing together. He's trying to rule the world, but the world's a pretty big place. Not only does he have trouble from the north, but from where else? According to verse 44, the north and the east. Okay, now think about this now. We have ruled out the south. We ruled out the north. We ruled out the east, because these are all people that are problems for him that are attacking him. What's the only direction that does not attack him? West. By a sheer process of elimination and deduction, therefore, where is he from? Though he is the West. Right? So he is a Westerner. I said, how far west? Daniel's just not that specific. Nowhere in the Bible is more specific than that. but that kind of gets you down to Europe or, the Western Hemisphere, like, perhaps North America. I guess you could say that South America, being that is part of the Western Hemisphere. My guess would be most likely Europe. What would have constituted the West from John's perspective, the perspective of the ancient world. And going forward, we'll see more reasons. And he could come from America. I'm not going to 100% say no, he's not from America. What I can say, definitely, based on this biblical data, is he is from the West. Probably not America.
You probably lean toward Italy.
Do I?
You probably lean toward Italy.
Not necessarily. Anywhere in Europe, type of thing. So, that's why I say Zelensky. Who knows? He could be. I'm not saying he is, but I'm not necessarily going to lean toward. But I do lean toward Europe and territory that once fell under the control of the Roman Empire. So that would be his background. So we can't get more specific than that. But my guess, unless that's just that, is that probably Europe. So is he going to be some American president? I don't think so. Again, every time you have a new election, everyone, I wonder if he's the Antichrist. Probably not. Probably not. And that being the case, what is interesting is that the Bible just doesn't say much about America in prophecy. So right now, from the human perspective, we see America as the most important nation in the world. But it is interesting how God always sees things so different than man. From God's perspective, he's not really that important. In fact, you didn't even make it in the book. We don't even get a mention. So, actually it means one of two things. That can mean one of two things. Either one, it means, like I said, that America is just not that important. Not that we don't play some role right now. God is using us to be supportive of America, right? But in the actual end times, we're not as important as these other nations. The other possibility is that America is just somehow destroyed or taken over somehow. That seems less likely, but in the sovereignty of God, such things can happen. When God is ready to move and make things happen on the world stage, sometimes they can happen quite quickly. So, if God wanted to, 10 years from now, we could all be speaking Chinese or Russian. So that would be the other possibility. All right, so then we say then that the Antichrist is likely a Westerner. What then would be his identity? If he's somebody from the West who has lived before and had died by the time John wrote Revelation, who might he be? Well, of course, we can't know for sure, but there are some common suggestions. One common suggestion is that he would be the Roman Emperor Nero, because if this is a Western empire that the Antichrist has, then you're going to think of some world leader who came from the West in the past and is going to come back. And certainly the Roman Empire has a strong Western orientation. Of the ancient major world empires, it had the most Western orientation. And so the Roman Emperor Nero is somebody that would come to mind. This would be the fellow who was responsible for putting the apostles Paul and Peter to death. And one of the reasons that he is a particularly interesting suggestion is because we know that the mark of the beast, that number 666, would tie into his name. In the ancient world, rather than using numbers, they used letters of the alphabet to represent numbers. And so you could take a person's name and spell it out and simply add up the numerical value of the letters in his name and come up with different numbers. If you take Jesus' name, for example, and add it up, it adds up to 888. But what we're looking for is 666. And Nero's name, interestingly enough, does add up that way. The Latin version would be Nero Caesar. If you put it into Greek, Nero Kaiser. If you put it into Hebrew, it's going to look like this. And here would be the value of the Hebrew letters. When you take Nero's name and you put it in Hebrew as Nero Kaiser, you can see the value of each of the letters. You add it up and you get 666. So that does make a pretty interesting and compelling case for Nero. Now, Every now and then, you might hear somebody, maybe on the internet or something, talk about 616. Where does that number come from? Well, first of all, there's just a handful of manuscripts, old Greek manuscripts, that have the number 616 rather than 666. They're not the oldest manuscripts, but it pops up in just a handful of those manuscripts. This is likely not the original reading, because in the original manuscripts, they actually spelled out the numbers, so there's no confusion at all. And all the ones where it's spelled out, 660 and 6, well, that's what you get, 666. But there are times when they simply use the letters representing the numbers. And as I said, there are a few manuscripts where they simply use the letters, and we get up with a combination of 616. And where that comes from is it still represents Nero. In the Greek, there's an extra letter that when you put it into Greek or into Hebrew that gets dropped off. See, it's this final N here, or the final letter here, that's there when you get 666. So all you have to do is take this final letter and remove it, and you've lost a value of 50, and then you get 616 instead of 666. So either way you get Nero, but most scholars are convinced that the correct number is 666. But I just mentioned that in case you ever hear that sometimes, somebody pointing out, hey, it should be 616. It kind of where you'll know where they're coming from. So there is that possibility. Another possibility of a leader from the West who is very powerful would be a Greek king. Well, wait a minute, let me mention one other thing before we move on to the Greek king. I forgot I wanted to talk about this. When we talk about the letters that represent the number 666, here's an example of what it looks like in Greek. You've got the three letters that's going to represent 660 and 6. There's a little line drawn across the top, and that line across the top is just there to let you know that these letters aren't representing letters, they represent numbers. So if you do letters and you draw the line across, that means we're using them as numbers. And I want to point out that ever since 9/11, there's been a popular suggestion that has come up that you might hear now and then, and that is the suggestion that the Antichrist would actually be a Muslim. Now, I would disagree with that, talk a little bit more about that going forward. But the idea is that the Antichrist just might be a Muslim. And in support of that, they try to point out how the way 666 looks in the Greek manuscript there, if you look at it carefully, why it's kind of suggestive of the name Allah and the way it looks when it is spelled in Arabic language. So let me give you an example. This is what the name Allah actually looks like, spelled out in Arabic. So that's the typical representation for the name Allah. Well, now initially this doesn't look anything like the name here, but wait a minute, if you play around with this a little bit, first of all, you flip and give us a reverse image. So rather than looking like this, you flip it, and you get the reverse image like if you were looking in a mirror. So you look at it in reverse, and then you rotate it a quarter turn. You rotate it a quarter turn, so the line that was on the side is now at the top. Why, it starts, looking a little closer to what we're talking about here, because I say, see how that little symbol here kind of looks like that, and this kind of looks like this, and oh wow, look, there's a line across the top, and here's a line across the top. So we've got this, this, and this, all represented in the name Allah, and then here would be part of the name Allah, but it would represent two crossed swords. And an image of two crossed swords is commonly an image that you'll see representing Islam. So the two swords of Islam and the name Allah. But of course, you really have to, like I said, play around a lot with it. They don't explain all of that. They'll just say, hey, that's actually the name Allah. It's like, well, no, only if you reverse it and you flip it and you add in the two crossed swords. Then you get something that kind of looks like the name Allah. So that's a popular idea that's out there. It's just one more example again of people trying to force stuff into the Bible. Great example, starting with a conclusion. I want to believe that the Antichrist would be Muslim. Now I'm going to go to the Bible and see if I can find anything that reminds me of Islam in the Bible. If you go looking for it, you'll find it. Now, you might have to get kind of creative in the ways in which you force it in there. You'll find a way to force it in there if you want. So I'm not at all buying that. That, to me, is just a ridiculous approach toward the text. All right, but then let's move on to then to this next idea, the Greek king that we said, rather than Roman, a Greek king from the 160s BC is named Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the better known leaders from the ancient world, not only from history, but also from the Bible. Now, why would I single out this particular fellow? Well, it is because Daniel singles him out and talks a lot about him in the book of Daniel. So take a look at Daniel chapter 11. We're going to look here, Daniel chapter 11, a little earlier than when we were looking at the end of the chapter. End of the chapter, we see he's a Westerner. We back up earlier in the chapter, and we find Daniel is talking about this king Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he had told us how Alexander the Great would rise to power and conquer the world, but then he would die, and his empire would be split up and carved up among his 4 generals. And one of the generals would take the control of the land of Syria, just north of Israel. And he would try to expand his empire by conquering Egypt and taking control of that. Now, between Egypt and Syria is the little nation of Israel. So Israel gets caught up in the middle of this. Now, I want you to notice how Daniel introduces us to him. In Daniel 11:21, he says, "And in his state shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries." Daniel begins in verse 21 by saying, okay, this king I'm talking about now is going to replace a prior king. In the prior verses, he talked about a Greek king before him, and a few verses before that, the Greek king before him. So he's kind of telling the history. Alexander dies, his kingdom's carved up. You get one of his generals takes over Syria, he rules, and then his son rules, and then the next guy rules, and the next guy. And he's going right down the line, giving us the history of the Greek rulers of Syria. In verse 20, this guy dies, and so in verse 21, you get another guy coming along, and the guy who comes along now is Antiochus Epiphanes. Clearly, though, he's saying, and Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be in place of the previous king. He's the new leader. And so he rises up, and he obtains the kingdom, the verse says, peaceably, by flattery. So he comes across as a very peaceful guy, but he's really grabbing for power. In verse 23, jump to verse 23, we're told that after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small people. So the guy has a small little start, and he seems to be a nice guy, very peaceful, but he's actually very ambitious, grabbing for power. Now then, you jump down to verse 28, it's going to tell us how, in his bid for power, he's going to make a move against Egypt and conquer Egypt, but it's not going to go so well because the Egyptians are going to come upon the Romans. The Romans are not yet a world empire, but they're starting to rise and become prominent. By this point in world history, they've gotten pretty good power over the Mediterranean Sea. And so the Egyptians call upon the Romans to come and ally with them and help them against this king Antiochus Epiphanes. So verses 28 through 31 says, "Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant," that meaning against the Jewish people. "And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. And at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Kittim," Paul said the ships of Kittim. Kittim is referring to Rome. So ships from Rome, he says, "shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand in his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So what Daniel says, he's going to go to attack the Egyptians are going to hire the Romans, and with the help of the Romans, they're able to stave off his attack, and he gets very upset. He throws a temper tantrum, so on his way back home from Egypt, back up north to Syria, he stops in Israel and takes it out on the Jewish people, begins to persecute and kill the Jewish people. One of the things he does in Israel, he goes to Jerusalem, and he defiles the Jewish temple. He goes in there and he puts an idol of Zeus in the Jewish temple. And he sprinkles pig blood, because pigs are considered unclean by the Jews, sprinkles pig's blood in that sanctuary. And so he defiles it. And verse 31 refers to the way he defiles the temple as the abomination that maketh desolate. The abomination of desolation. Now this is very significant, because when he does this, and all this has now been fulfilled in history, Daniel was prophesying, but this is all history now for us, happened in the 160s BC. But here's the point, that what he does is very similar to what the Antichrist is going to do in the end times. The only other time the Bible uses this expression, the abomination that maketh desolate, or the abomination of desolation, is when it talks about something the Antichrist is going to do during the tribulation period. During the tribulation period, the Antichrist will defile the temple the way this guy did. And he will have an image of himself set up in the temple. And he will defile it by going into the Jewish temple and proclaiming himself to be God. And the Bible calls that event, when he sets up his own image there in the temple and calls himself God, it calls it the abomination of desolation. So both Antiochus Epiphanes did that in history, and the Antichrist is going to do it again in the future. And so it's like history repeating itself. So you can see as a minimum why Daniel talks about this guy, because in this guy you're getting a preview of the Antichrist. But as Daniel continues to talk about him, I want you to notice what he says in verse 35. He says, some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, and to make them light, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. What he's saying is, some of the understanding Jews, with insight and understanding, are going to stand up against him. They're going to fight back against Antiochus Epiphanes to reclaim their temple and cleanse it. And he says, in fact, there will always be Jews who will be standing up and fighting for their nation. And he says this will happen all the way until the time of the end, all the way until the end times. And it's for a time appointed yet. So in other words, it says when Antiochus Epiphanes comes along and defiles the temple, does the abomination of desolation, that's not the end times. But you will find people stand up and continue to stand up for the next 2,000 years on behalf of their people until the time of the end, which is going to be, like I said, yet out in the future. As we know, it would be 2,000 years from the time that Daniel was describing here. And then I want you to notice as he continues, he has now introduced us to the end times. He went from what will happen during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes to talking all the way about the time of the end. And in that context, having just brought up the time of the end, that's way out there 2,000 years in the future, he goes on in verse 36 and says, and the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, and that is determined shall be done. I want you to notice how from verse 35 to verse 36, he continues talking. He says, the king. And when he says the king, he hasn't introduced to us a new king. And we began talking about Antiochus Epiphanes back in verse 21, and it was very clear, I'm introducing a new king. The previous guy, at the end of verse 20 says, he'll die, he'll be destroyed. And in his place, verse 21 says, you'll get Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, now, you would expect that we're done with Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 35 because we've jumped ahead 2,000 years into the future. And so in verse 36, as he continues, he's got to be talking about some other guy. But instead he says, and the king. He doesn't say a new king or a different king. It sounds like he's talking about the same king. What he's going to do now. And he's going to be a very arrogant person. So it's like Daniel jumps ahead 2,000 years into the future, talking about what this guy is going to do 2,000 years in the future. He never introduces a new guy. He seems to be talking about the same guy. He says, well, how can a guy be around 2,000 years into the future? I mean, nobody lives 2,000 years. That's because the guy will be resurrected. And so everybody is agreed. One thing that Bible scholars, conservative Bible-believing scholars, are agreed on here is that from verse 36 on, we are now describing the Antichrist. So here in Daniel 11, verses 21 through 35 is describing Antiochus Epiphanes in history. In verse 36, everybody agrees we jumped ahead 2,000 years in history because everything from verse 36 forward has not been fulfilled. From verse 36 on, none of this happened. Verses 21 through 35, you look back and say, boy, it all happened just like Daniel said. We can see it in history. You get to verse 36 forward and say, none of that stuff happened in history. This is prophecy. This is the end time stuff. And yet it is the same guy that he's talking about, continues to talk about him. And so, Antiochus Epiphanes. And so, this gets us back to where we talked in verse 40. Verse 40 is how we know he's a Westerner then. This is where we're told, hey, he's going to attack the north, he's going to attack the south, he's going to attack the east. so he is a Westerner. All right, so now, what then do we make of Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, there are two ways that Bible scholars commonly approach it. Number one, some say he's a type, a picture, an illustration of the Antichrist, and that's why Daniel talks so much about him. Because, hey, he did the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist is going to do that. Now, some see him as a type of the Antichrist. The other possibility that really I lean toward is he's not merely a type of the Antichrist, he is the Antichrist. This is the guy who's going to come back from the dead. I mean, he was dead by the time John wrote Revelation, and so he fits the picture. So I think it's a very good choice. Now, there is one more suggestion that people often make, and that is perhaps it could be Judas Iscariot. And I don't think the Antichrist is a Jew, so this isn't the strongest suggestion, but some people think he might be a Jew, and in particular Judas Iscariot. And why did they say that? Once you take your Bibles and look at John 17 and verse 12. The idea comes from John chapter 17 and verse 12. Now, other than the general idea that we know that he was possessed by the devil himself, not merely a demon, but Satan himself, well, that's going to be true of the Antichrist as well. The Antichrist isn't simply empowered by some lower level demon. It's Satan himself. But the stronger argument that people make in favor of Judas is the comment that Jesus makes about him in John 17:12. He says, "While I was with them in the world, I kept them in thy name. Those that thou gavest me I have kept, and none of them is lost, but the son of perdition." Jesus here told about his disciples. He said, "I've kept them. They're all saved, except the one," and we know which disciple wasn't saved. That was Judas Iscariot. He's talking about Judas. He's the one exception. But I want you to notice how he characterizes him here. He calls him the son of perdition. The son of perdition. That designation, son of perdition, is used only one other time in Scripture, in all of the entire Bible, about only one other person. And if you guessed it, that one other person is the Antichrist. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 2, if you want to take a quick look there, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 2 is where the Apostle Paul is describing the Antichrist for us. 2 Thessalonians, I think I said chapter 3, verse 2. It's 2, verse 3, if I said it backwards. I meant to say chapter 2, verse 3. He's talking about the Antichrist here, 2 Thessalonians 2, 3. He says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed." All right, there's the Antichrist, the man of sin. And then notice how he characterizes him. The son of perdition. So both Judas Iscariot and the Antichrist are the only two called the son of perdition. So some see that as an indication of his identity. That is an interesting point, but I don't see why it couldn't be that both were considered sons of perdition. In other words, there's no hope for them at this point. There is no hope for them. The expression son of perdition just means they've already crossed a day of opportunity. There is no chance, no opportunity for them to be saved, and there's no question about it. At this point, Judas's destiny was determined. He was going to be going to hell. He missed his opportunity to get saved. And the same thing with Antiochus Epiphanes. He had his chance the first go around in this world, and he didn't get saved. Well, he's not going to get saved during the tribulation period. So I would say that Antiochus Epiphanes could also be a son of perdition. So at any rate, those are the three most common suggestions, though. The Roman Emperor Nero, which does make sense from a historical standpoint. So especially if you're going to make history the lens to which you interpret the Bible, right? If history is the primary lens, and we talked about this last time, right? If you start with history, you're really going to gravitate toward the Roman Emperor Nero from a historical standpoint. But if you start with the biblical data, then I think you might lean a little more toward the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes, because you look at Daniel, and Daniel makes a lot about Antiochus. He talks about him not only here in chapter 11, but earlier in the book of Daniel as well, and talks about him again in a good amount of detail. So twice Daniel really talks about this guy, to the point that you're saying, that's something really important about this man, because Daniel just talks about him a lot. And I think that's the reason, because Daniel is basically telling us this is the Antichrist. So, this is what we know about his identity, a resurrected man and a Westerner. Now I want to move the discussion to what he will do. We've talked about who he is. Now let's try to talk about what it is he will do and when he will do it. A lot of people have bits and pieces of information about the Antichrist, but they don't have much context for that information. They don't know how to organize it. They might know what he will do, but not really when. And so, I hear people saying things about how they'll see something going on in the world, and they'll say, well, I wonder if this has to do with the Antichrist. I wonder if this is part of the Antichrist. With the pandemic coming on, when the vaccines came out, I heard people talk about, well, the vaccine, I wonder if that's the mark of the beast. Well, if you suggest that was the mark of the beast, you're simply illustrating that you don't have a good handle on the timeline. You have an idea of something that's going to happen in the end time, but you don't have any sense of when it happens. So we want to know not only what he's going to do, but when he's doing it. And we break this down into three main parts. First of all, we talk about his rise to power. His rise to power will occur during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. First 3.5 years of the tribulation period. He's kind of reaching for power. Now, obviously, he starts out with a little bit of power, but he will increase his power throughout that first 3.5 years. The first thing definitively that we know he will do when he pops up on the scene, that the Bible says, again, he may have been in the world scene, but the Bible doesn't tell us what he's been doing on the world scene until this first event that it actually identifies. That's Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 is talking about the Antichrist, and it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. All right, pause here. Notice the reference to the abomination, to making it desolate. There's the abomination of desolation concept. But what we want to notice is verse 27 begins by saying he will confirm a covenant with many, and contextually the many would be many Jewish people. He's going to make a covenant with the Jewish people for a week. King James Version says a week. Literally, the Hebrew is just a septet, that is the number 7, something that transpires over, the sequence of 7. And again, contextually in the book of Daniel, we know he means 7 years. So in other words, he's going to make a covenant that will last for 7 years. All right. And then in the midst of the 7 years, he's going to break that covenant. But this really marks the beginning of his rise to power. This is actually the definitive event, then, according to Daniel, that starts the end time clock ticking, the final 7 years of the tribulation period. So the 7 years begins, he signs the covenant, we start counting the 7 years. He signs the covenant. And then having signed the covenant, as we said, he continues then to try to amass power, and so he is presumably the rider on the white horse. This introduces to us Revelation chapter 6 and verse 2. Revelation chapter 6 gives us the famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. One of those horses is white, and that's what we see in verse 2 of chapter 6. He says, I saw and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. Now John doesn't tell us who the rider on the white horse is. So here we have to make an educated guess and admit that we're somewhat tentative. But there are really only 2 good options here. Some suggest, well, he's riding a white horse. That must be Christ, the good guy. But remember that the Antichrist, right, is a false Christ. And he's going to imitate Christ. Satan's the great imitator. He always imitates God. So I think in this case, this is not Jesus Christ. It's the false Christ, the Antichrist, riding on a horse. Later at the end of the book of Revelation, we see Jesus making his grand entrance on his white horse. And he does indeed conquer. But this is the Antichrist coming across. Again, perhaps the significance of the white horse is, as we saw in Daniel 11, he's a very deceptive. He will claim to be a person of peace. This is why he starts out with a peace covenant, a peace deal that he gets with the Jews there in the Middle East. But he's not really about peace. He's really about grabbing power. The third thing that we know that he will do during the first 3.5 years of tribulation period that will really, extend his power is he will create this 10-nation confederation. So 10 nations or powers will be supporting him. We get this from Revelation 17, verses 12 and 13. Look at Revelation 17, verses 12 through 13. John here has been given a vision, and then the interpretation of the vision. Here's the interpretation. The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. Paul's here talking about symbols in the Old Testament. Again, horn is a common symbol for a power, a king, or a kingdom. So naturally, 10 horns would represent 10 kings and or their kingdoms, right? So he says, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. So he says we have 10 kings, or 10 kingdoms. And he says their kingdoms don't exist yet. So at the time that John is writing Revelation, at the end of the 1st century, these are nations that don't now exist. But they're going to exist someday. So again, they might be the modern nations. Again, perhaps 10 European nations, or at least Western-based nations. And they'll form a coalition, an alliance, and they will all throw their power and their support behind the Antichrist. So the Antichrist isn't just a single go along man. He's got these 10 nations that are behind him and supporting him. So this is his real rise to power. And then there's one more thing that we know about him during the first 3.5 years, and that is that he, well, wait a minute, before we move on to that, we talk about the 10-nation confederation. Again, I suggest that they might be a kind of European Union. Not the current European Union as such, because there are way more than 10 nations in it. So it'd be a different kind of union. But it might be various European nations, and just for fun, I kind of illustrate how you've got symbolism that comes out of Europe that is very suggestive of the vision of Revelation 17. Because in chapter 17, John sees this image of a woman riding a beast. And that beast is this end-time empire of the Antichrist, this 10-nation coalition. And so here's a magazine coming out of Germany with a lady on a beast holding a flag of the European Union. And likewise, again, here's a bronze image of a woman on a beast. Now, this might not have anything to do with Revelation. It may just be recalling old European mythology, the goddess Europa, in the pre-Christian era of Europe, before Europe was Christianized. So it could be harking back to that. Kind of the way Hitler did. If you know anything about Hitler, he was very much into, really doing away with Christianity and instead getting back to the old pagan roots of Germany and the great mythology. But it is an interesting image there and an interesting tie-in. Likewise, for example, you've got this poster coming out of Europe that is an obvious allusion to the story of the Tower of Babel. This is an image here of the Tower of Babel being built. It's not completed. And you can see it is intended to be a representation of a famous Renaissance painting of the Tower of Babel. They made it look just like it. And then it says on there, Europe, many tongues, one voice. Definite allusion, see, to the biblical account. Oh, we might speak many tongues, but we are united in our rebellion against God. So you can clearly see that kind of impulse in Europe here. And again, here's the headquarters of the European Union. They're in Brussels. And again, the building itself is made to look like it's an iconic version of the unfinished Tower of Babel. So this is clearly a fist in the face of God. Another suggestion, commonly suggested, is that we're not looking at 10 nations, but rather the goal that the Club of Rome aspired to more than 50 years ago. The group called the Club of Rome, and these rich, powerful, wealthy, influential leaders hatched a plan to divide the world up into 10 regions. So the entire world divided up into 10 regions. And so some have suggested that that could be it. So we don't know, because the Bible doesn't name the nations. John said they were nations or kingdoms that didn't exist in his time, so there was no way for him to necessarily to name them. I guess he could have thrown out the name. Nobody would have known what it was. But anyway, those are just suggestions. We can't know, just interesting things to think about. But then we come back to the fourth thing that is true of the Antichrist during the first half of the tribulation period, and that is he maintains a working relationship with Mystery Babylon. Now, what is Mystery Babylon? We'll talk about that more going forward in the course. But essentially, in a nutshell, it is a false apostate religious system that will be in place in the end times. And so the Antichrist is going to associate with this religious system. In other words, he is going to use religion to to help propel him to power. And again, in a future session, we'll see that when he's done with that religious system, he'll cast them aside. But he's going to use religion initially. We get that here from chapter 17, verses 3 through 8. This is where he describes the mystery of Babylon and this vision of the beast. Verse 3 and following in chapter 17 says, "So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition." I'll say, all right, we get to verse 8. That's the verse we saw earlier, why we know that the Antichrist is a resurrected individual. Well, he's represented by the beast. The woman that rides him, the harlot, is Mystery Babylon. So the woman and the beast goes together. That is the Antichrist and this false religious system. And it's one of those cases where the religion thinks they're using the Antichrist, and the Antichrist is using the religion, each for their own purposes, but in the end, it's the Antichrist that's going to come out on top. So then, this brings us to the middle of the tribulation period. We get exactly at the zenith of his power, 3.5 years. He's been continually amassing power, and by the midpoint of the tribulation, he has the power that he's been seeking. And how does all this come about? Well, several events associated. First of all, we go back to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, we find that at the midpoint of the tribulation, the first thing he will do is invade Israel. Daniel chapter 11, verse 41 says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon." And so he's going to enter into the glorious land. That's the land of Israel. Now, he says some other nations that today would be the modern equivalent of Jordan will escape out of his hands. So the Jordanians will be safe, but he's going to invade Israel. Again, this is when he breaks the covenant. Remember, he begins, we saw, by making a covenant with Israel. And Daniel 9 said at the midpoint of the 7 years, he will break the covenant. We are now at the midpoint. This is when he breaks the covenant. And rather than peace, he's turning on the Jewish people with whom he had made a deal. And he's attacking them. Excuse me. Now then, when he invades and attacks, he successfully takes control of the nation. And the first thing he then does is move his capital to Jerusalem. His capital had been based in the west, perhaps in the city of Rome. And we'll talk again in the future section why we think that. But he comes from the west. His capital was in the west. But now that Israel is under his control, he moves his capital to Jerusalem. We know this just a little bit later here in Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. Verse 45 says, "And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." So it says he's going to plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Between the sea, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, in the glorious holy mountain. The glorious holy mountain is Mount Zion, Jerusalem. So his palace, the headquarters of his kingdom, based in Jerusalem. Now then, once he invades, takes control of Jerusalem, and makes that his new capital, what's the first thing he does? He kills the 2 witnesses. There are 2 witnesses that will have been serving the Lord, witnessing and testifying all throughout that first 3.5 years of the tribulation. And nobody has been able to stop them. I believe the 2 witnesses are Moses and Elijah. But now the Antichrist is on the scene, and God has given Jerusalem into his control. The first thing he does is he goes to the temple and he kills them. We know this from Revelation chapter 11. It's Revelation chapter 11 that tells us how the ministry of these 2 witnesses comes to an end. Take a look at Revelation chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11 and verses 7 through 12. It says, when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascended out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither! And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. All right, so verse 7 begins by saying that when they finished their testimony, that God is done with them. They have led enough people to faith in Christ, and now their converts will continue on the work. So God is done with them. So He allows the Antichrist to kill them. Again, you notice that the Antichrist is coming out of the bottomless pit, or the abyss. He comes out of Hades, and he kills them. And this would be at the midpoint of the tribulation then, when he is now in Jerusalem. And again, we receive further confirmation of that, I think, from the fact that they are dead for exactly 3.5 days. Did you notice that when he kills them, they lie dead in the streets for 3.5 days, and then God resurrects them. The Spirit of life comes into them. Well, 3.5 days seems kind of odd. Why not 2 days? Why not a nice even 3 days? Jesus was dead for 3 days. Why not 3 days like that? But instead, 3.5 days. That may seem like an odd number to you. But there's logic behind that. I think the 3.5 days is symbolic of the fact that just as they were resurrected after being dead for 3.5 days, the Jewish nation is going to be spiritually resurrected and come to life in exactly 3.5 years from this point. Right? If we're at the midpoint of the tribulation, we got 3.5 years to go. And in 3.5 years, all the Jews are going to get saved, right? They'll all come to faith in Christ. The Bible says, that a nation will be born in a day, referring to the Jewish nation. Now they're all going to get saved. Jesus is going to come back. So I think there's some symbolism here, that just as these two Jewish witnesses, Moses and Elijah, are dead for 3.5 days and then come to life, now it says 3.5 days the Jewish nation is going to come to life. That is in 3.5 years. Which means that this event is exactly at the midpoint. All right, so now he is in Jerusalem. He's got the two witnesses out of the way. So now that he's got them out of the way, they were based there at the temple, but they're now dead. So they're out of the way. Like I said, he's got full access to the temple. So what's the next thing he's going to do? Well, we've already talked about this, how he will defile the temple and declare himself to be God. That comes again from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, is the most clear statement of that. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Again, the Old Testament uses the terminology of the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate. So he's going to do something terrible that will defile the temple. But it's the New Testament, the writings of Paul, where we're told exactly what it is that will defile that temple. So 2 Thessalonians 2:4 describes the Antichrist this way: who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And so the Bible is very clear about that as well, that he's going to defile the temple, declare himself to be God. And this then is the backdrop to what we find in Revelation chapter 13. Once he goes in and declares himself to be God, well then naturally, since he's declared himself to be God, he's going to require all the world to worship him. And we see this described in Revelation 13. And we'll wrap up here tonight with this last observation. Revelation chapter 13, look at verses 4 through 6. Verses 4 through 6. It says, they worship the dragon, that's the devil, which gave power to the beast, that's the Antichrist. And they worship the beast, saying, who was like unto the beast, who was able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue, note the time, 42 months. That's the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Now, So he's got the zenith of his power, and he will hold it for 3.5 years. Verse 6, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And so this individual who speaks this great blasphemy against God for 3.5 years, and then you jump down to verse 8. Verse 8, it says, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. So all the world required to worship him. The only people that don't are those that are among the elect, those who are destined to get saved during the tribulation period. God will give them the eyes to see and understand that he's not really God, and they won't go along and they won't worship him. So God will providentially protect the elect, even if they're not saved yet, but they're destined to get saved. God will protect and preserve them from getting involved in the worship of the Antichrist. Well, there's a little bit more yet that is associated with the Antichrist at the midpoint of the tribulation period, but we're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it here. But here, then again, the summary, 5 key points we've seen so far what happens at the midpoint. Invades Israel, then moves his capital there to Jerusalem, kills the 2 witnesses who were based in Jerusalem at the temple. Having gotten them out of the way, out of the temple, he goes into the temple, declares himself to be God. That's the abomination of desolation. And then he requires all the world to worship him. With that, we're going to wrap up.